Officer Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as his patrol car rumbled along the dusty backroads of Riverside County. It was another scorching August afternoon, the kind where the California sun turned asphalt into liquid mirrors and made every breath feel like inhaling from an oven. The thermometer on his dashboard read 104 degrees, and Jake had been patrolling these desolate stretches for nearly 6 hours without a single call. Just another quiet Tuesday in the middle of nowhere, he thought, reaching for his lukewarm coffee. Jake had been with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for 12 years, and if there was one thing he'd learned, it was that the quiet moments never lasted. His intuition had been honed by a decade of responding to domestic disputes, car accidents, and the occasional drug bust. But today felt different. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air, like the desert itself was holding its breath. As he approached mile marker 7 on Thornton Road, Jake's radio crackled with static. He adjusted the volume, expecting dispatch to break the silence with some mundane call about a broken-down vehicle or trespassing complaint. Instead, only white noise filled the car. He was about to radio in his position when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the rumble of his engine. A whimper, high-pitched and desperate. Jake's foot instinctively hit the brake pedal. His patrol car skidded slightly on the loose gravel before coming to a complete stop. He killed the engine and rolled down his window, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the whisper of hot wind through the dried brush. Then he heard it again, clearer this time. A puppy's cry, filled with terror and pain. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, grabbing his radio as he threw open the door. The heat hit him like a physical wall, but adrenaline was already flooding his system. He'd been a dog lover his whole life, had grown up with 3 German shepherds, and the sound of a distressed animal activated every protective instinct in his body. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23, he said quickly, his eyes scanning the barren landscape. "I'm at mile marker 7, Thornton Road. Possible animal in distress. Investigating now." "Copy that, Unit 23, came the bored response from dispatch. "Keep us updated." Jake clipped the radio to his belt and moved toward the source of the crying. The old Thornton property stretched before him 50 acres of abandoned farmland that had been left to rot after the family moved out 5 years ago. The main house was a skeleton of rotted wood and broken windows, and the barn had partially collapsed in on itself. Most officers avoided this place. It was a haven for transients and teenagers, looking for a place to drink away from prying eyes. But today, Jake wasn't thinking about trespassers. His focus was entirely on that heartbreaking sound, which was growing more frantic by the second. He jogged past the rusted chain-linked fence, his boots crunching on dried grass and brittle weeds. The crying was coming from beyond the house, near what used to be a creek bed. During the wet season, water would flow through here, but August had turned it into nothing more than a scar of cracked earth and scattered rocks. As Jake rounded the corner of the dilapidated barn, his heart stopped. There, approximately 30 feet ahead in a section of the dried creek bed, was a small patch of wet sand that glistened in the harsh sunlight. And trapped in the center of it, sinking slowly but steadily, was a tiny golden puppy. Its fur was matted with mud, its little paws scrambling uselessly against the liquefied sand that was pulling it down like the hand of death itself. "Oh God," Jake breathed, his mind immediately recognizing what he was looking at. Quicksand. Real quicksand. Formed by an underground spring that must have created a pocket of saturated sand beneath the dried surface. He'd heard about such things existing in the desert, but in 12 years of patrol, he'd never actually encountered it. The puppy's terrified brown eyes locked onto Jake, and it let out another desperate whimper. The animal couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, barely the size of Jake's boot, and it was already sunk halfway into the deadly trap. Every struggle the puppy made only accelerated its descent. The wet sand bubbled and churned around its small body, a hungry mouth slowly swallowing its prey. Jake's training kicked in immediately. He assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a veteran officer facing a crisis. Distance to target, 30 feet. Condition, critical. Time remaining, less than 60 seconds before full submersion. Environmental hazards, unstable ground, potential for rescuer to become victim. Available resources, limited. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his radio again. Dispatch, Unit 23. I need backup at my location immediately. I've got a puppy trapped in quicksand near the old Thornton Creek bed. This is urgent. Copy. Unit 23. Nearest unit is 20 minutes out. Do you need animal control? 20 minutes. Jake looked at the puppy, watching as its head dipped lower, the sand now reaching its neck. In 20 minutes, there would be nothing left to rescue but a memory. Negative on waiting for backup, Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. I'm going in now. If I don't report back in 5 minutes, send everyone. Unit 23, please wait for. Jake switched off the radio. There wasn't time for protocols or procedures. There wasn't time for anything except action. The puppy's eyes were still locked on his, pleading, begging, trusting that this human would save it from the earth that was swallowing it whole. Jake sprinted toward his patrol car, his mind racing through possibilities. He needed something to distribute his weight, something to extend his reach. In the trunk, he kept emergency equipment road flares, a first aid kit, a spare tire. His eyes landed on a coil of rope, and then he remembered the collapsed barn. There had been wooden planks scattered around the debris. He ran back toward the barn, sweat pouring down his face, his uniform shirt already soaked through. Time seemed to move in strange ways, both impossibly fast and agonizingly slow. He could hear the puppy's cries growing weaker, more desperate. Or maybe they were just farther away as the animal sank deeper. Jake grabbed the longest, sturdiest plank he could find, nearly 6 feet of weathered wood that looked like it had once been part of the barn's wall. It was heavy, splintered, and perfect. He dragged it toward the quicksand, the rope slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. When he reached the edge of the deadly patch, Jake dropped to his knees and assessed the situation one final time. The puppy was now sunk to its chin, its little head tilted back to keep its nose above the surface. The sand continued its relentless pull, indifferent to the tiny life it was claiming. "Hang on, little guy," Jake whispered, positioning the plank at the edge of the stable ground. "I'm coming for you. Just hang on." He lay flat on the plank, distributing his 210 pounds across as much surface area as possible. It was the same technique he'd learned in military training years ago for crossing thin ice or unstable terrain. Slowly, carefully, he began to inch forward, pushing with his toes, pulling with his fingers, every movement calculated and controlled. The puppy watched him approach, its cries now reduced to pitiful whimpers. Jake could see the terror in those brown eyes, could see the animal's strength fading. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The plank groaned under his weight, but held firm. He was close now, so close he could almost reach the puppy. Then disaster struck. The puppy's head dipped below the surface. "No," Jake shouted, lunging forward. The plank wobbled dangerously, threatening to tip him into the quicksand alongside his target. But Jake didn't care about safety anymore. He didn't care about procedure or protocol, or the very real possibility that he might die out, here in this abandoned creek bed, trying to save a dog he'd never met. All he cared about was that tiny golden puppy whose head had just disappeared beneath the sand, taking with it any chance of survival. Jake took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever deity might be listening, and plunged his arm deep into the cold, sucking quicksand, fishing blindly for a life that was slipping away with every passing second. Jake's arm plunged into the quicksand up to his shoulder, the cold, dense mixture enveloping his limb like a living thing. The contrast between the scorching desert air and the icy underground water was shocking, but he barely registered it. His fingers spread wide, searching desperately through the thick, soupy sand for any sign of the puppy. Nothing. Just endless cold mud. Come on, he growled through gritted teeth, his face pressed against the wooden plank as he reached deeper. His shoulder screamed in protest as he stretched further than his body wanted to allow. The plank beneath him creaked ominously, and Jake felt it beginning to sink on one side. If he wasn't careful, he'd be joining the puppy in its sandy grave. Then his middle finger brushed against something soft. Fur. Adrenaline exploded through Jake's system. He adjusted his angle, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder socket, and pushed his arm even deeper. His hand closed around what he hoped was the puppy's body. It was impossible to tell in the thick darkness beneath the sand. Whatever he'd grabbed felt small and terrifyingly still. Got you, Jake whispered, beginning to pull. The quicksand had other plans. The suction was incredible, far stronger than Jake had anticipated. It was like trying to pull a cork from a bottle, except the bottle was fighting back with the force of the entire earth. Jake's military training had prepared him for a lot of things: combat situations, hostage negotiations, physical confrontations with suspects twice his size, but nothing had prepared him for this bizarre tug-of-war with nature itself. He pulled harder, his bicep bulging with effort. The plank groaned and shifted beneath him. For a terrifying moment, Jake felt himself sliding forward, felt the edge of the quicksand reaching for his own body like eager fingers. He dug the toes of his boots into the solid ground behind him, using his legs to anchor himself. "I'm not losing you," he snarled, his voice raw with determination. "Not today, not ever." Jake adjusted his grip, feeling the puppy's tiny ribcage in his hand, and pulled with everything he had. His face turned red with exertion, veins standing out on his neck and forehead. The August sun beat down mercilessly, sweat pouring into his eyes and making them sting. His uniform shirt was completely soaked through, clinging to his back like a second skin. The quicksand released its grip with a sudden, sickening papa, the sound of a vacuum seal breaking. Jake flew backward, the momentum sending him tumbling off the plank and onto the hard-packed dirt behind it. He crashed onto his back, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but his hand remained clenched protectively around the puppy. For a moment, Jake lay there gasping, staring up at the cloudless blue sky, his chest heaving. Then reality snapped back into focus. The puppy. Was it alive? He scrambled to a sitting position, cradling the small, mud-covered animal against his chest. The puppy was completely coated in thick brown sand, its features barely distinguishable. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. No, Jake muttered, his hands shaking as he carefully turned the puppy onto its side. He'd completed basic first aid training every year for the past 12 years, but they'd never covered CPR for dogs. Still, the principles had to be similar, right? Airway, breathing, circulation. Jake used his thumb to gently open the puppy's mouth, scooping out globs of wet sand from its tiny throat. More sand. So much sand. How long had it been submerged? 30 seconds? A minute? How long could a puppy survive without oxygen? He cleared as much sand as he could, then placed his mouth near the puppy's nose and gave 2 gentle puffs of air. Not too much, or he'd damage the small lungs, but enough to hopefully inflate them. Nothing happened. The puppy remained limp and lifeless in his hands. Jake's vision blurred, and he realized with shock that tears were streaming down his face, cutting clean tracks through the dirt and sweat. Come on, buddy. Come on. Breathe. Please breathe. He tried again, 2 more gentle breaths, then carefully pressed on the puppy's tiny chest with 2 fingers, performing compressions. He counted in his head 1, 2, 3, 4, then gave 2 more rescue breaths. The puppy's body was so small, so fragile. Jake was terrified he'd press too hard and break ribs, but he was equally terrified that being too gentle would mean death. Breathe. Jake shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Don't you dare die on me. Another round of compressions. Another 2 breaths. Jake's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely maintain his grip. He'd faced down armed criminals, had been shot at twice in his career, had responded to horrific accident scenes that haunted his dreams, but nothing had ever terrified him like this moment. Then the puppy coughed. It was a small sound, barely audible, followed by a weak sputter as sandy water dribbled from the puppy's mouth. But it was the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. The puppy's tiny ribcage expanded with a shuddering breath, then another. Its eyes remained closed, but its chest was moving up and down on its own now. Yes, Jake laughed, the sound halfway between a sob and a shout of triumph. Yes, that's it, buddy. Breathe. He carefully positioned the puppy to drain any remaining water and sand from its lungs, supporting its head as it continued to cough and sputter. Color was returning to the puppy's gums, which had been an alarming grayish blue just moments before. Now they were fading to a healthier pink. Jake grabbed his radio with his free hand, the other still carefully supporting the puppy. Dispatch, Unit 23. Crisis resolved. I need animal control and a vet to meet me at Riverside Animal Hospital immediately. I'm transporting now. Copy that, Unit 23. Are you injured? Jake looked down at himself. His uniform was destroyed, covered in mud, torn at the shoulder, and soaked with sweat. His right arm was completely brown with sand up past the elbow. He'd have bruises tomorrow from the impact of his fall. But none of that mattered. Negative. I'm fine. But I need that vet ASAP. He carefully wrapped the shivering puppy in his emergency blanket from the patrol car, creating a warm cocoon around the traumatized animal. As he walked back to his vehicle, Jake kept looking down at the small bundle in his arms, checking obsessively that the puppy was still breathing. Each tiny rise and fall of its chest felt like a miracle. Once in the car, Jake cranked the heater despite the 104-degree temperature outside, knowing that hypothermia was a real risk after cold water exposure. He placed the bundled puppy gently on the passenger seat and started the engine, already planning the fastest route to the animal hospital. As he pulled away from the Thornton property, leaving the deadly quicksand behind, Jake glanced over at his tiny passenger. The puppy's eyes were still closed, but it was breathing steadily now, its small chest rising and falling with a regular rhythm. You're going to be okay, Jake whispered, reaching over to gently stroke the puppy's head through the blanket. I've got you now. You're safe. But as he accelerated down Thornton Road, emergency lights flashing, Jake couldn't shake a strange feeling of unease. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. What was a puppy doing out here in the middle of nowhere? There were no houses for miles, no farms, nothing but abandoned property and desert. Puppies didn't just appear out of thin air. And as his fingers touched the puppy's head again, he felt something unusual beneath the matted, mud-caked fur. Something that felt like a collar? No, not exactly a collar. Something embedded in the skin itself. Jake's cop instincts, which had been overridden by his rescue instincts for the past 10 minutes, suddenly roared back to life. This wasn't just a lost puppy. This was something else entirely. Something that his 12 years of experience told him was going to lead somewhere dark and complicated. But first, the puppy needed medical attention. The mystery could wait. It would have to wait. As Riverside Animal Hospital appeared on the horizon, Jake pressed harder on the accelerator. Dr. Sarah Chun, the best veterinarian in the county, and a woman who'd helped him on several unusual cases before, was already waiting outside. He'd called ahead using his personal cell phone, giving her a quick rundown of the situation. What he didn't tell her, what he was only just beginning to realize himself, was that this rescue was just the beginning. A tiny mud-covered puppy, breathing softly beside him, was carrying secrets that would shatter everything Jake thought he knew about his quiet corner of California. And those secrets were tattooed right onto its skin. Dr. Sarah Chun was waiting in the parking lot of Riverside Animal Hospital when Jake's patrol car screeched to a halt, emergency lights still flashing. She rushed to the passenger side before Jake could even kill the engine, her medical bag already in hand. Sarah was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen everything from routine checkups to emergency surgeries. She'd been the go-to veterinarian for the sheriff's department for 5 years, treating canine units and occasionally helping with wildlife rescues. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was about to discover. "How's the patient?" Sarah asked as Jake carefully lifted the blanket-wrapped bundle from the passenger seat. "Breathing on his own now," Jake reported, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and residual adrenaline. "He stopped breathing for maybe 2 minutes. I had to perform CPR. Got a lot of sand out of his airway, but I don't know if there's still more in his lungs." Sarah's professional demeanor kicked in immediately. "Bring him inside, quickly." They rushed through the clinic's back entrance, past the waiting room filled with curious pet owners and their animals, and straight into the emergency examination room. Jake gently placed the puppy on the stainless steel table under the bright surgical lights. For the first time, he could really see the small creature he'd pulled from death's grip. Even covered in drying mud, the puppy was beautiful. Its fur appeared to be a rich golden color, though it was hard to tell beneath all the sand. It couldn't have weighed more than 5 or 6 pounds. With oversized paws that suggested it would grow into a decent-sized dog someday, if it survived the next few hours. "Okay, let's see what we're working with," Sarah murmured, putting on her stethoscope and listening to the puppy's chest. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Heart rate is elevated but strong. Breathing is labored definitely, some fluid in the lungs. "I'm going to give him oxygen and some medication to help clear his airways." Jake watched, feeling helpless, as Sarah worked with practiced efficiency. She placed a small oxygen mask over the puppy's face, inserted an 4-line into its tiny leg, and began administering medications. The puppy whimpered softly, but didn't struggle. It seemed too exhausted to fight. "He's lucky you found him when you did," Sarah said, making notes on her tablet. "Another minute or two, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Now let's get him cleaned up so I can do a proper examination." Using warm water and gentle soap, Sarah began washing away the layers of mud and sand that coated the puppy's body. Jake helped, carefully working the debris from the animal's fur. As they cleaned, the puppy's golden coat emerged, shimmering under the lights like spun honey. "Beautiful color," Sarah commented. "Probably a golden retriever mix. Though the facial structure is a bit unusual." She stopped mid-sentence. Her hands froze on the puppy's belly, and Jake saw her face go pale beneath the harsh examination lights. "Sarah? What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed a magnifying glass from her instrument tray and leaned in closer, studying something on the puppy's skin. Her jaw tightened, and Jake recognized that expression. It was the same look she got when she found something that didn't make sense. Something that violated her understanding of how the world should work. "Jake," she said slowly, her voice carefully controlled. "Come look at this." Jake moved around the table to stand beside her. Sarah pointed to the puppy's belly, where the fur was thinnest and the pink skin showed through. At first, Jake didn't see anything unusual. Then Sarah adjusted the light, and his blood ran cold. Numbers, tattooed directly onto the puppy's skin in small, precise black ink. RDRLO47G-EN3, Jake read aloud, his cop brain automatically memorizing the sequence. What the hell? That's not all, Sarah said grimly. She gently turned the puppy to show its left hip. More tattoos. A barcode, like something you'd see on a product in a store, along with what appeared to be a date. June 15th, 2025. Jake felt sick. Someone tattooed a puppy? What kind of monster? It gets worse, Sarah interrupted. She carefully lifted the puppy's ear, revealing a small metal tag that Jake had felt earlier, but hadn't been able to see beneath all the mud. Using tweezers, she gently worked it free from where it had been partially embedded in the skin behind the ear. The tag was made of surgical steel, corroded at the edges, but still legible. Stamped into the metal was a logo, a stylized double helix wrapped around a medical cross, and beneath it, words that made Jake's heart sink. Redwood Research Laboratory, Genetic Division. The room fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the oxygen machine and the puppy's labored breathing. Redwood Research Laboratory. Jake repeated slowly, his mind racing. Why do I know that name? Sarah was already typing frantically on her tablet. Because 3 years ago, they made national news. Let me pull up the articles. She turned the screen toward Jake, and he read the headlines that appeared. Pharmaceutical lab raided by federal agents. Redwood research shut down amid animal cruelty allegations. Scientists vanish as charges filed in illegal testing scandal. Jake scanned the articles quickly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Redwood Research Laboratory had been a cutting-edge pharmaceutical and genetic research facility located about 60 miles from Riverside County. The owners, a married couple named Marcus and Delilah Vandermeer, had been brilliant scientists with impressive credentials, doctorates from MIT, published research in prestigious journals, contracts with major pharmaceutical companies. But behind the legitimate facade, they'd been conducting illegal experiments. The exact nature of the experiments was still classified, but the public information was damning enough. Unauthorized genetic testing on animals, failure to follow ethical protocols, falsifying research data, and most disturbingly, allegations of creating genetically modified animals for sale to private buyers. Federal agents had raided the facility in August 2022, expecting to arrest the Vandermeers and shut down the operation. But the couple had vanished days before the raid, tipped off by someone inside the investigation. Over 200 animals had been seized: dogs, cats, rabbits, even some exotic species. All of them had supposedly been rehomed or transferred to sanctuaries under federal supervision. This puppy was born in June, Sarah said quietly, pointing to the date tattooed on its hip. June 2025, 3 years after Redwood was shut down. Jake met her eyes, and he saw his own realization reflected there. Which means the Vandermeers didn't disappear, Sarah finished. They've been operating this whole time, underground, continuing their research. And this puppy is proof. Jake pulled out his phone and began taking photographs of the tattoos, the metal tag, the puppy's unusual features. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from residual adrenaline or the implications of what they'd discovered, he couldn't tell. Sarah, I need you to do a full examination. Blood work, genetic testing if you can, x-rays, everything. And I need you to scan for a microchip. Sarah nodded, already preparing her equipment. Jake, if this is what I think it is, if the Vandermeers are still out there doing this, we're talking about a major federal case. This goes way beyond the sheriff's department. I know, Jake said. But first, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Can you do the microchip scan now? Sarah grabbed her scanner, a device that looked like a large television remote. She powered it on and slowly moved it across the puppy's body, starting at the head and working her way down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the scanner beeped, and Sarah's screen lit up with information. She stared at the display, her face growing even paler. "Oh my God, what? What does it say?" Sarah turned the scanner toward Jake. The screen showed a registration number, a date, and most importantly, a name. Registered owner, Redwood Research Laboratory. Animal ID, RDRL 47. Classification, GEN3 prototype. Status, active project. Active project, Jake breathed. "Sarah, what does GEN3 mean?" "Generation 3, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just a puppy they've been breeding, Jake. This is the third generation of whatever they've been creating. Which means they've been doing this continuously for years, probably breeding specifically for certain genetic traits. This is a full-scale illegal operation." Jake looked down at the small puppy, now breathing more easily under the oxygen mask, completely unaware of the bombshell it represented. This tiny creature, which he'd pulled from Quicksand just an hour ago, was evidence of crimes that could put people in federal prison for decades. "I need to call this in," Jake said, already pulling out his phone. "Federal authorities need to know about this." "Wait," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "Think about this carefully. The Vandermeers have stayed hidden for 3 years. They clearly have resources, connections, maybe people on the inside feeding them information. If you call the feds right now, word might get out. They could disappear again, destroy evidence, move their operation." Jake paused, his finger hovering over his sergeant's number. Sarah was right. The Vandermeers had escaped justice once before because someone had tipped them off. If that happened again, they'd never be found. And how many more animals would suffer while they remained free? "So what do you suggest?" Jake asked. Sarah looked at the puppy, then back at Jake. "You're a good investigator. You've solved cases before. What if we do some digging first? Quietly. Find out where this puppy came from, how it ended up in that quicksand, whether there are more of them. Get solid evidence before we alert anyone who might have loose lips." Jake knew what she was suggesting was technically against protocol. He should report this immediately to his superiors, who would contact federal authorities, who would take over the investigation. But Sarah was right about one thing: the Vandermeers had evaded capture once before by staying one step ahead. 24 hours, Jake decided. We investigate quietly for 24 hours. If we don't find anything solid, I take it to my sergeant, and we go through proper channels. "Deal? Deal?" Sarah agreed. She looked back at the puppy, gently stroking its damp fur. "I'll keep him here overnight for observation. He needs fluids and antibiotics to prevent pneumonia. But Jake, be careful. People who tattoo puppies and run illegal genetic labs aren't going to take kindly to someone uncovering their operation." Jake nodded grimly. He was already thinking about his next move, returning to the Thornton property, searching the area where he'd found the puppy, looking for any clues about how it had gotten there. Someone had to have brought it to that location. Puppies didn't just wander miles into the desert on their own. As he headed for the door, Sarah called after him. "Jake, what are you going to name him?" Jake turned back, looking at the small golden puppy that had survived Quicksand, stopped breathing, and come back to life. The puppy that was about to blow open a case that could shake the entire county. "Lucky," Jake said with a slight smile. His name is Lucky, because that's exactly what he is. And what Jake didn't say, but what they were both thinking, was that Lucky's survival might be the luckiest break in a federal investigation that everyone thought was long closed. The hunt for the Vandermeers was back on. And this time, Jake Morrison wasn't going to let them slip away. Jake Morrison sat in his darkened living room at 2:47 a.m., his laptop screen casting a blue glow across his exhausted face. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that tiny golden puppy sinking into the quicksand, saw those horrific tattoos, saw the Vandermeers' smug faces in the old news photos he'd been studying for hours. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he took another sip anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. His living room had transformed into a makeshift command center, papers spread across the coffee table, printouts of news articles covering the couch, photographs of Lucky's tattoos pinned to a makeshift bulletin board he'd created on his wall. Jake had always been thorough, a trait that had earned him commendations and solved cases that others had given up on. But this felt different. This felt personal. Maybe it was because he'd held that puppy while it struggled to breathe, felt its tiny heart flutter back to life under his hands. Or maybe it was because Jake had always hated bullies, and people who hurt defenseless animals were the worst kind of bullies. He clicked through another database, cross-referencing property records with corporate filings. The Vandermeers had vanished in 2022, but they'd left behind a trail if you knew where to look. Bank accounts had been frozen, assets seized, their mansion in San Diego sold at auction. But Jake's years of investigation had taught him that people with money and connections always had contingency plans. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Lucky's stable. Temp normal, breathing clear. No complications so far. Any luck on your end? Jake typed back. Maybe. Found something weird. Call you in the morning. What he'd found was a pattern. In the months before the federal raid on Redwood Research Laboratory, there had been a flurry of property purchases throughout Southern California desert properties, abandoned farms, foreclosed ranches, all purchased through different shell corporations with opaque ownership structures. Most had been seized during the investigation, but 3 had slipped through the cracks, their ownership buried under so many corporate layers that the federal agents had apparently missed them. One of those properties was the old Thornton place where Jake had found. Lucky. Jake pulled up the county assessor's records. The Thornton property had been purchased 18 months ago by something called Desert Horizon Development LLC for $180,000 cash. Desert Horizon had no website, no business license, no apparent legitimate business operations. It was a ghost company, and according to the corporate registration, it was based in Delaware, the go-to state for people who wanted to hide ownership. But Jake had learned a trick from a federal agent he'd worked with on a fraud case 2 years ago. He started tracing the corporate filings backward, following the breadcrumbs through layers of shell companies. Desert Horizon was owned by another LLC, which was owned by a trust, which was managed by a law firm in Las Vegas. At 3:15 a.m., Jake hit pay dirt. Buried in the trust documents that were publicly available but rarely examined, he found a name, Delilah Hartman. Not Vandermeer Hartman. Delilah's maiden name. Gotcha, Jake whispered to his empty living room. His hands flew across the keyboard. If the Vandermeers were using Delilah's maiden name, they might be using Marcus's too. He searched for Marcus Brennan, the name listed in Marcus's graduate school records that Jake had found in an old MIT alumni directory. Within minutes, he'd found 2 more property purchases under similar shell company structures, both using variations of their maiden names. One property was a warehouse in San Bernardino, purchased 2 years ago. The other was an isolated ranch in the Mojave Desert, purchased just 6 months after the Redwood raid. Both paid for in cash through untraceable corporate entities. Jake sat back, his heart pounding. 3 properties. 3 possible locations where the Vandermeers could be operating. He needed to check them all, but he couldn't do it alone, not without raising suspicions. and not without backup. At 6 a.m., Jake's phone rang. It was Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, his direct supervisor, and a woman who'd mentored him since he'd joined the department. "Morrison, I got a weird message from dispatch about yesterday. Something about you rescuing a puppy from Quicksand? Want to tell me what's going on?" Jake had been dreading this conversation, but he also knew Maria was sharp. If anyone would understand the implications of what he'd found, it was her. He took a deep breath and told her everything: the rescue, the tattoos, the Redwood connection, his late-night investigation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jake," Maria finally said, her voice careful and measured, "you're telling me that Marcus and Delilah Vandermeer, two fugitives wanted by the FBI, might be operating right here in our county?" "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. "And instead of calling the feds immediately, you spent the night investigating on your own?" "I had a 24-hour window," Jake said. "And I was right, Maria. They own the Thornton property. Probably own other properties too. If we alert the FBI now without solid evidence, the Vandermeers will disappear again. You know they have inside connections. Someone tipped them off last time." Maria sighed deeply. Jake could picture her in her home office, probably in her robe with her reading glasses on, rubbing her temples the way she always did when dealing with complicated situations. "You should have called me last night," she said. But her tone wasn't angry. It was calculating. "But I understand why you didn't. What do you need?" Relief flooded through Jake. "I need Detective Lisa Hartwell from Special Investigations. I need a warrant to search the Thornton property. And I need this kept quiet, need-to-know basis only." "Hartwell's good," Maria agreed. "She's also discreet. I'll call her in. Meet me at the station at 08:00 hours. We're going to do this by the book, Jake, but we're going to do it smart. Bring everything you found, every document, every connection, every piece of evidence." "Thank you, Maria." "Don't thank me yet. If this goes sideways, we're both going to be answering some very uncomfortable questions from federal authorities. But if you're right, if the Vandermeers really are back in business, then we have a duty to shut them down. Those people are dangerous, Jake. They're brilliant, well-funded, and clearly have no moral boundaries. You watch your back." At exactly 8 a.m., Jake walked into the conference room at the Sheriff's Department headquarters. Maria was already there, along with a woman Jake recognized, but had never worked with directly Detective Lisa Hartwell from the Special Investigations Unit. Lisa was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and the kind of intense focus that made witnesses uncomfortable and suspects downright nervous. She had a reputation as a bloodhound. Once she got on a case, she never let go until it was solved. She'd put away 3 corrupt politicians, broken up 2 major drug trafficking rings, and solved a series of cold case murders that everyone else had given up on. "Officer Morrison," Lisa said, shaking his hand with a grip like steel. "Maria's been filling me in. Show me what you've got." For the next hour, Jake presented his findings. He walked them through the timeline, showed them the property records, explained the shell company connections, and displayed the photographs of Lucky's tattoos and identification tags. Lisa took notes, asking sharp questions that demonstrated she was already 3 steps ahead, thinking about warrants, evidence chains, and prosecution strategies. "This is solid work," Lisa finally said, sitting back in her chair. "Really solid. But we have a problem." "What problem?" Jake asked. "The Thornton property is the obvious move. We get a warrant. We search it. Maybe we find evidence. But if the Vandermeers are monitoring that property, the moment we show up with a search team, they'll know we're onto them. They could destroy evidence at their other locations, or worse, disappear again." Maria nodded. "Lisa's right. We need to be smarter about this. What if we don't go unofficial?" Jake suggested. What if I go back to the Thornton property alone, in civilian clothes, like I'm just checking on where I found the puppy? I scout the location, see if there's anything visible, any signs of activity. Too dangerous, Maria said immediately. If they're watching that property, then they already know someone found their puppy, Jake interrupted. They probably expected animal control to pick it up, not a cop. But if that same cop comes back, alone, just poking around, I'm just a concerned officer checking on a rescue site. It's not suspicious. Lisa studied him for a long moment. You're right. It could work. But you don't go alone. I'll be in a civilian vehicle, half a mile away. You'll be wired. First sign of trouble, I'm coming in hot with backup. Over the next 3 hours, they planned the operation with military precision. Jake would return to the Thornton property at 2 p.m. a time, when the desert heat would keep most people indoors, but still had enough daylight for visibility. He'd be wearing civilian clothes with a concealed body camera and audio transmitter. Lisa would monitor from a distance with a tactical team on standby. But they needed more than just surveillance. They needed a warrant, which meant they needed to convince a judge that there was probable cause to search the property. That's where Sarah came in. At noon, Jake returned to the animal hospital. Lucky was awake now, his golden eyes bright and alert, despite the IV still attached to his tiny leg. When the puppy saw Jake, his tail wagged weakly, the first sign of personality since the rescue. "Hey there, little guy," Jake whispered, gently stroking Lucky's head. "You're looking better." Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding a manila folder thick with documents. "I did the full workup like you asked. Jake, you need to see this." She laid out the test results on her desk. Blood work, genetic analysis, X-rays. But it was the genetic report that made Jake's blood run cold. "This puppy has been genetically modified," Sarah explained, pointing to markers on the DNA analysis. "Someone has altered his genetic code, enhanced certain traits while suppressing others. Based on these markers, I'd say they were breeding for intelligence, temperament, and physical characteristics. This isn't natural breeding, Jake. This is genetic engineering. Can you testify to that?" Jake asked. "In court? To a judge?" "Absolutely. This is clear evidence of illegal genetic modification on an animal. Combined with the tattoos and the microchip registration, any judge would grant a search warrant." By 1:30 p.m., they had their warrant. Judge Patricia Kowalski, a no-nonsense former prosecutor who hated animal cruelty, had signed it within 20 minutes of reviewing the evidence. Now came the dangerous part. Jake stood at the edge of the Thornton property at exactly 2 p.m., wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, looking every bit like a civilian rather than a cop. His heart hammered in his chest as he spoke quietly into the microphone hidden in his collar. "Moving in now," he said. "No visible activity. No vehicles. Property appears abandoned." Lisa's voice crackled in his nearly invisible earpiece. "Copy that. We've got your location. Proceed with caution." Jake stepped onto the property, his eyes scanning every shadow, every window, every potential hiding spot. The farmhouse looked even more dilapidated in the afternoon light, a corpse of a building slowly being reclaimed by the desert. But as he moved toward the collapsed barn where he'd found the wooden plank yesterday, something caught his eye. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Recent tire tracks. Someone had been here, and recently. Jake's cop instincts screamed at him that he was walking into something much bigger than a simple abandoned property. He was about to discover just how right those instincts were. Jake's boots crunched softly on the sun-baked earth as he followed the tire tracks away from the collapsed barn. His hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where his service weapon usually sat. But he was in civilian clothes, unarmed, except for the pepper spray in his pocket. The absence of his gun made him feel naked and vulnerable. "Lisa, you seeing this?" Jake whispered, adjusting the body camera hidden in his shirt button. Fresh tire tracks, maybe 2 or 3 days old. Heavy vehicle, probably a truck or van. Copy that. Lisa's voice crackled in his earpiece. We're recording everything. Keep your distance from any structures. This is reconnaissance only. But Jake's curiosity was pulling him forward like a magnet. The tracks led around the back of the farmhouse, through tall, dried grass that scratched at his jeans, toward what appeared to be the remnants of an old barn foundation. From the road, this area wasn't visible. It was completely hidden by the farmhouse and the natural rise of the desert terrain dot as Jake pushed through the grass. The scene before him made his breath catch in his throat. What he'd thought was just another collapsed barn was actually something far more deliberate. Yes, the barn had fallen, but it looked staged, almost artfully arranged to appear abandoned, while actually concealing something beneath. Jake knelt down, examining the weathered wood planks more closely. They weren't nailed down. They were loose, desiring to be moved. His pulse quickened as he carefully lifted one of the boards, revealing something that shouldn't exist on an abandoned property. A concrete surface underneath, clean and recently poured. Lisa, Jake said, his voice tense. I've got a false structure here. The collapsed barn is camouflage. There's new concrete underneath. Jake, do not proceed further, Lisa commanded sharply. That's an order. Back away and wait for the tactical team. But Jake was already moving boards aside, his cop instincts overriding his common sense. Beneath the false debris, he found it a reinforced steel door set flush into the concrete, a kind you'd see on a bank vault or a secure government facility. There was a keypad lock beside it, its LED display glowing a faint red. Active. Powered. Someone was paying the electricity bill on this abandoned property. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a property the Vandermeers owned. This was an active facility. His hand hovered over the keypad, knowing he shouldn't touch it, knowing that alerting whoever monitored this system would blow the entire investigation. Jake, I'm calling in the team right now, Lisa said urgently. Get away from that door immediately. That's not a request. Jake stepped back, but his eyes were scanning the area, taking in every detail. That's when he heard a sound so faint he almost missed it. A whimper. A dog's whimper, coming from below the ground. There are animals down there, Jake said, his voice filled with sudden urgency. Lisa, I can hear them. They're alive. The implications hit him like a freight train. If there were animals in that facility, they needed food, water, climate control. Which meant someone was coming here regularly. Which meant the Vandermeers, or their employees, could show up at any moment. Team is en route, ETA 8 minutes, Lisa reported. Jake, get to the rally point now. If someone shows up, Jake never heard the rest of her sentence, because at that exact moment, he heard the sound of an engine. A vehicle approaching on the dirt road. Fast. His training kicked in. Jake dropped flat behind a section of broken fence, pressing himself into the sparse cover as a white panel van roared up the driveway, dust billowing in its wake. Through the settling cloud of dirt, he watched as the vehicle parked near the concealed entrance he'd just discovered. The van's door opened, and a woman stepped out, late 30s, athletic build, wearing scrubs and carrying what looked like bags of dog food. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd made this trip 100 times before, clearly comfortable and unsuspecting. She wasn't Delilah Vandermeer. Jake had memorized the couple's faces, but she was obviously working for them. The woman began uncovering the entrance, moving the boards with practiced ease. She punched a code into the keypad. Jake couldn't see the numbers from his position, and the steel door hissed open on hydraulic hinges. A blast of cool, sterile air escaped from below, and Jake caught a glimpse of fluorescent lighting and stainless steel before the woman ascended into the facility with her supplies. She left the door open. Jake, Report. Lisa's voice was insistent in his ear. We heard the vehicle. What's your status? Jake's mind was calculating rapidly. The tactical team was still 6 or 7 minutes away. That door would close soon, probably on an automatic timer. This might be their only chance to see what was inside before the Vandermeers were alerted and could destroy evidence. One female subject, approximately 5'7", brown hair, medical scrubs. She just entered the facility. Door is currently open, Jake whispered. Lisa, if that door closes, we might never get another chance like this. Absolutely not, Lisa said firmly. You are not going into that facility alone. That's a direct order, Morrison. But Jake was already moving, keeping low, approaching the open entrance. He knew he was violating protocol. He knew he could blow the entire case. He knew he was risking his career, and possibly his life. But he also knew that every second that passed was a second the evidence could be destroyed. Animals could be moved, and the Vandermeers could slip through their fingers again out at the entrance. Jake peered down into a concrete stairwell lit by harsh fluorescent lights. He could hear sounds echoing from below, dogs barking, equipment humming, and the woman's voice talking to someone, though he couldn't make out the words. I'm going in, Jake whispered. Lisa, I'm sorry, but I'm going in. Jake. God damn it. He muted his earpiece and descended into the darkness. The stairwell was steep, at least 20 feet down, leading to a reinforced door that stood partially open. Jake moved silently, his back against the cool concrete wall, every sense on high alert. At the bottom, he carefully peered through the gap in the door. What he saw made his blood run cold, and his anger ignite simultaneously. The underground facility was massive, far larger than seemed possible from the surface. It stretched out before him like something from a science fiction movie. The main corridor was lined with kennels on both sides, each containing dogs of various breeds and ages. But these weren't ordinary kennels. Each was equipped with monitoring equipment, feeding systems, and what looked like medical apparatus. Digital displays above each kennel showed vital signs, genetic markers, and identification numbers. Jake counted quickly. 30 kennels. At least 20 were occupied, but the kennels were just the beginning. Beyond them, he could see laboratory equipment, genetic sequencers, centrifuges, microscopes, computers with multiple monitors displaying complex data. One entire wall was covered with filing cabinets. Another section appeared to be a surgical suite, complete with an operating table and anesthesia equipment. This wasn't some makeshift puppy mill. This was a sophisticated genetic research facility, probably worth millions of dollars, hidden beneath an abandoned farm in the middle of the California desert. The woman in scrubs was moving through the kennels, filling water bowls and checking on the animals. The dogs watched her with a mixture of hope and fear. They knew her as their caretaker, but they also knew they were prisoners. Jake's camera was recording everything, sending the feed back to Lisa and her team. This was evidence. Undeniable, devastating evidence. But he needed more. He needed to find proof that the Vandermeers were directly involved. Needed to find client records, financial documents. Something that would tie this operation to the fugitive scientists and their wealthy buyers. As he watched, a door at the far end of the facility opened. Jake's heart nearly stopped as a man entered, tall, distinguished-looking, probably in his 50s, wearing a white lab coat. Even from a distance, even though the man's appearance had changed with age and a beard, Jake recognized him from the photos he'd studied all night. Marcus Vandermeer, the fugitive himself, walking casually through his illegal laboratory as if he didn't have a care in the world. Jake's hand trembled as he adjusted his camera angle, making sure he captured clear footage of the man's face. This was it. This was the proof they needed. Marcus Vandermeer, wanted by the FBI, operating an underground genetic laboratory in Riverside County. Marcus approached the woman, discussing something Jake couldn't hear. Then Marcus moved to one of the computer stations and began typing, pulling up what looked like client files. Jake strained to see the screen, but he was too far away. He needed to get closer. Just a few feet closer, and his camera might be able to capture those files. But moving meant the chance of being discovered, of blowing the entire operation. Jake took a deep breath and made his decision. He slipped through the door into the facility, staying low, using the kennels as cover. The dogs noticed him immediately, but mercifully, most were too well trained or too frightened to bark. A few whimpered softly, their eyes pleading for rescue. Soon, Jake mouthed silently to them. I promise, soon. He moved closer to the computer station, positioning himself behind a large piece of equipment. From this angle, his camera had a direct line of sight to Marcus's screen. Jake could see lists of names, dollar amounts, genetic specifications, client orders, proof of sales, evidence that would seal the case. Then Marcus's phone rang. Yes? Marcus answered, his voice cultured and calm. There was a pause as he listened. What do you mean someone was snouting around the property? When? Today? Another pause, and Jake watched as Marcus's expression changed from calm to concerned to alarmed. How do you know? Emotion sensors? Show me the footage. Jake's stomach dropped. Motion sensors? Cameras. Of course the Vandermeers would have surveillance on the property above. Of course they'd been watching. And now they knew someone had discovered their entrance. Marcus's eyes widened as he looked at something on his phone, probably footage of Jake examining the door. That's a police officer, Marcus said, his voice rising. That's the same cop from the news who found our puppy. Delilah, we need to evacuate. Now, alert everyone. Shut it all down. The woman in scrubs stopped what she was doing, her face pale. But the animals, we have 30 animals here. We can't just leave them, Marcus snapped. Wipe the computers and go. We have maybe 10 minutes before this place is swarming with federal agents. Jake knew his cover was blown. He unmuted his earpiece, just as Lisa's frantic voice filled his ear. Jake, we see Marcus Vandermeer on your feed. Tactical team is 2 minutes out. Get out of there now. But Jake wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not while Marcus was trying to destroy evidence. Not while these animals' fates hung in the balance. He stood up from his hiding spot, making himself visible. Marcus Vandermeer, Jake called out, his voice echoing through the facility. You're under arrest. Marcus spun around, shock and rage crossing his face as he saw Jake standing in his secret laboratory. And in that frozen moment, Jake knew that the next 2 minutes would determine whether justice was finally served or whether the Vandermeers would escape once again. The standoff lasted exactly 7 seconds. Though it felt like an eternity, Marcus Vandermeer stared at Jake Morrison with a mixture of disbelief and calculation, his hand still hovering over the keyboard where he'd been attempting to wipe the files. The woman in scrubs had frozen in place, a bag of dog food clutched to her chest like a shield. The underground facility hummed with the sound of ventilation systems and the soft whimpers of imprisoned animals. Then chaos erupted. Marcus lunged for the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate attempt to execute whatever deletion protocol he prepared. The woman dropped her supplies and bolted for the exit stairs. Jake sprinted forward, diving across a laboratory table to reach Marcus before he could destroy the evidence. Stop right there, Jake shouted, but Marcus was faster than he looked. The scientist yanked a USB drive from the computer and hurled it across the room, where it shattered against the concrete wall. Backup files, probably. Evidence destroyed in an instant. Jake tackled Marcus just as the older man reached for another computer. They crashed into a rolling cart full of medical supplies, sending syringes and vials scattering across the floor. Marcus fought with surprising strength, fueled by desperation and years of evading capture. "You don't understand what we're doing here," Marcus gasped as they struggled. "We're advancing science. We're creating perfection. You're torturing animals and breaking federal law." Jake shot back, finally managing to pin Marcus's arms behind his back. The thunder of boots on the stairwell announced the arrival of the tactical team. Within seconds, the facility was flooded with armed officers in full gear, their weapons trained on every corner. Detective Lisa Hartwell descended the stairs like an avenging angel, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Secure the suspect," she commanded. "Someone catch that woman before she reaches the surface." Two officers pulled Marcus away from Jake, cuffing him with swift efficiency. The scientist's eyes were wild, darting between the officers and his precious laboratory. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Do you know what I've accomplished?" "Yeah," Jake said, breathing hard as he stood up. "You're Marcus Vandermeer, and you're under arrest for about 24 federal crimes." Lisa was already on her radio, coordinating with the teams above ground. "Subject 2 is female, late 30s, brown hair, wearing medical scrubs. She's heading for a white panel van. Cut her off before she reaches the main road." Through Jake's earpiece, still transmitting, they heard the response. "Got her. Subject in custody." As officers secured the facility and began photographing evidence, Jake walked through the kennels, looking into the eyes of each imprisoned dog. Golden retrievers, German shepherds, Labrador retrievers, even a few exotic breeds he didn't recognize. All of them wore the same tattoos. Lucky had identification numbers, dates, genetic classifications. All of them were victims. "We'll get you out of here," Jake promised them quietly. "All of you." Over the next 6 hours, the scene became a carefully orchestrated operation. Federal agents arrived, furious that locals had cracked a case they'd thought was cold, but grudgingly impressed with the evidence Jake and Lisa had gathered. Animal welfare specialists documented each dog, providing immediate medical care and preparing for transport to sanctuary facilities. Computer forensics experts began the painstaking process of recovering data from the laboratory systems. But there was a problem. A big one. "Where's Delilah?" Lisa asked Jake as they stood in the facility, watching evidence being cataloged. "We got Marcus. We got his assistant, a woman named Rebecca Marsh, by the way, who's already asking for a lawyer. But Delilah Vandermeer is still in the wind." Jake had been wondering the same thing. Marcus had mentioned Delilah on the phone, had told her to evacuate, which meant she'd been warned, which meant she was currently running, possibly destroying evidence at other locations, possibly fleeing the country. "We need her," Lisa said grimly. "Without Delilah, this case has holes." She was the lead geneticist, the brains behind the modifications. Marcus handled the business side, like Delilah did the science. Defense attorneys will argue Marcus was just the money man, might get his sentence reduced. Jake nodded, frustration building. They'd won a battle, but not the war. Then, the next morning, everything changed. Jake was at the sheriff's department, drowning in paperwork and giving his 5th statement of the day, when the front desk officer called back to the detective's bullpen. "We've got a walk-in," she said. "Young woman says she has information about the Vandermeer case. Says she worked at the facility. She's asking specifically for Officer Morrison." Jake and Lisa exchanged glances and hurried to the interview room. Sitting at the table was a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. She was in her mid-20s, with dark circles under her eyes and hands that trembled as they clutched a coffee cup. Her name tag from a local coffee shop was still pinned to her shirt. "Emily." "I'm Emily Torres," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I'm the one who helped that puppy escape. The next 3 hours revealed a story that was somehow both horrifying and redemptive. Emily had graduated from UC Davis with a degree in veterinary science 18 months ago, drowning in student debt and desperate for work in her field. When she'd answered an ad for a veterinary assistant position at what was described as a private animal breeding facility, she'd thought it was legitimate. The pay was excellent, $75,000 a year, and the work seemed straightforward enough. At first, it seemed normal, Emily explained, tears streaming down her face. I was just taking care of puppies, monitoring their health, administering medications. The facility was beautiful, state-of-the-art. Dr. Vandermeer de Lelish was brilliant. She taught me so much about genetics and animal development. But slowly, Emily had begun to notice things that didn't add up. The puppies had tattoos. Buyers came in the middle of the night. The facility was hidden underground. When she'd asked questions, she'd been told it was for security purposes, that they were protecting proprietary breeding techniques from competitors. I wanted to believe them, Emily sobbed. I needed the job so badly. And they were so nice to me, treated me like family. But 6 months in, I overheard a conversation between Marcus and Delilah. They were talking about the federal investigation and how they'd learned from their mistakes. That's when I realized I was working for criminals. For fugitives. Jake leaned forward. Why didn't you go to the police then? I was terrified, Emily admitted. They'd made me sign all these NDAs, told me that if I ever talked about the work, they'd sue me into oblivion. And I'd seen enough to know they had connections, lawyers, politicians, wealthy people who bought their dogs. I thought if I reported them, they'd disappear, and I'd be left holding the bag. But Emily's conscience had eaten at her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she looked at those puppies in their kennels, she saw victims, not products. 2 weeks ago, there was a huge storm, Emily continued. Power went out, and the backup generator was taking a minute to kick in. In the chaos, I grabbed one of the puppies, the smallest one, a little golden retriever who'd just been weaned, and I took him upstairs. I drove him out to the Thornton Road, to an area where I knew people sometimes drove through. I left him near the road, hoping someone would find him, and that maybe, somehow, that would lead to the whole operation being discovered. Jake felt his throat tighten. That was Lucky, the puppy I found in the quicksand. Emily's eyes went wide. Quicksand? Oh my God, I almost killed him. I thought I was saving him, but you did save him, Jake said firmly. If you hadn't put him there, I never would have found him. We never would have discovered the facility. 28 other dogs would still be trapped down there. You saved all of them, Emily. Fresh tears poured down Emily's face, but this time they were tears of relief. Lisa pushed a box of tissues across the table and said gently, Emily, we need your help. We have Marcus in custody, but Delilah is still out there. We need to find her before she can destroy evidence or flee the country. Will you help us? Emily nodded vigorously. I'll tell you everything. Everything. And she did. Over the next several hours, Emily provided information that was worth its weight in gold. She knew about the other properties, the warehouse in San Bernardino, where they stored genetic samples and frozen embryos, the ranch in Arizona, where Delilah was probably hiding right now. She knew about the client list, memorized because she'd been the one who often coordinated pickups. She knew about the offshore bank accounts where payments were deposited. Most importantly, she had documentation. Emily had been secretly photographing files for the past 2 months, storing them on a hidden cloud account, building her own insurance policy in case the Vandermeers ever turned on her. Now she turned it all over to the investigation, hundreds of documents, emails, financial records, genetic modification protocols, and client communications. "This is a federal prosecutor's dream," Lisa said, scrolling through the files on Emily's laptop. "This is enough evidence to put the Vandermeers away for decades and to prosecute their clients for conspiracy." Jake pulled out his phone and showed Emily a photo of Lucky, now recovered and playing in Dr. Sarah Chung's office. "This is him now. The puppy you saved. We call him Lucky." Emily broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Jake moved around the table and put a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Emily. It took courage to come forward." "I was so scared," Emily whispered. "But when I saw the news, saw that officer who'd found the puppy, saw the facility being raided, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. Those animals deserved justice. And so did all the people the Vandermeers hurt." Lisa made a phone call, and within the hour, federal agents were preparing a coordinated raid on the Arizona property where Emily believed Delilah was hiding. Emily would receive immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony and cooperation, a deal that Jake thought was more than fair, given that she'd ultimately been the catalyst for bringing down the entire operation. As Emily was escorted to a safe house protected until the trials were over, Jake stepped outside the station into the cool evening air. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Lucky wants to see his hero. When are you coming by?" Jake smiled. In 48 hours, his quiet Tuesday patrol had transformed into the biggest case of his career. An illegal genetic laboratory had been shut down, dozens of animals had been saved, and 2 fugitives were either in custody or about to be. All because of one brave young woman and one tiny puppy who'd refused to give up, even when the world was literally swallowing him whole. Justice, Jake thought, sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. The pre-dawn darkness of the Arizona desert was absolute, broken only by the distant stars and the faint glow of Phoenix on the horizon. Jake Morrison sat in the back of an unmarked FBI surveillance van, wearing a tactical vest that felt foreign compared to his usual patrol uniform. Around him, 12 federal agents prepared for what they all knew could be the most important arrest of their careers. Special Agent Rebecca, Torres, no relation to Emily, was coordinating the operation from a laptop displaying satellite imagery of the target location. The ranch was isolated, sitting on 40 acres of desert scrubland 20 miles outside Sedona. According to Emily's intelligence, this was Delilah Vandermeer's primary residence, and likely where she'd fled after Marcus's arrest 3 days ago. "Radio check," Rebecca said crisply into her headset. "All units confirm." One by one, the teams responded. 4 tactical units surrounded the property at cardinal points. Local Arizona law enforcement had established a perimeter 2 miles out, preventing any escape routes. A helicopter waited at a nearby airstrip, ready to pursue if Delilah somehow managed to slip through the net. Jake technically had no jurisdiction here. He was 3 states away from Riverside County, but Rebecca had invited him to join the operation as a courtesy. "You started this," she'd said. "You should be here when we finish it." Detective Lisa Hartwell sat beside Jake, her face illuminated by her tablet as she reviewed the warrant one final time. They'd spent 72 hours building an airtight case, ensuring that when they arrested Delilah Vandermeer, there would be no legal loopholes for expensive lawyers to exploit. "It's 4:47 a.m., Rebecca announced. "We move at 5 a.m. sharp. That's the optimal time. Subjects are likely in deep sleep. Reaction time is slowest. Visibility is increasing, but neighbors are still asleep. Questions?" No one spoke. They all knew their roles. Jake's heart pounded as the minutes ticked away. He thought about Lucky, now safely recovering at Sarah's clinic and scheduled to be officially adopted by Jake next week. He thought about the 28 other dogs they'd rescued from the underground facility, now being cared for at sanctuaries across California. He thought about Emily Torres, whose courage had made all of this possible, currently under protective custody until the trials. And he thought about Marcus Vandermeer, sitting in a federal detention center, refusing to cooperate, refusing to reveal Delilah's location, protecting his wife even as his own freedom evaporated. 60 seconds, Rebecca said. The van's back doors opened silently. Agents filed out like shadows, moving with practiced precision toward their assault positions. Jake followed Lisa, staying behind the tactical team as instructed. His role was observer only, no heroics this time. The ranch house appeared through the darkness, like a modernist sculpture, all glass and steel and sharp angles, completely incongruous with the rugged desert landscape. Solar panels covered the roof. Security cameras dotted every corner. A high-tech fortress disguised as a luxury home. Cameras are looped, a tech specialist whispered into the comm. She's seeing recorded footage from 3 hours ago. She has no idea we're here. 30 seconds, Rebecca said. Remember, Delilah Vandermeer is brilliant, desperate, and potentially dangerous. She may have weapons. She may have escape plans we haven't anticipated. Stay sharp. Jake watched as the teams took their positions at every entrance. Thermal imaging had confirmed 2 subjects inside, one in the master bedroom upstairs, another in what appeared to be a downstairs office. Delilah, and possibly a bodyguard or assistant. 10 seconds. The desert held its breath. Go, go, go. The world exploded into controlled chaos. The tactical team breached the front door with a battering ram, the sound of splintering wood echoing across the desert. Federal agents. Search warrant. Get on the ground. Jake and Lisa entered behind the initial wave, moving through a living room that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. Leather furniture, abstract art, a view of the desert through floor-to-ceiling windows. The contrast between this luxury and the underground prison where they'd found the dogs made Jake's jaw clench with anger. Upstairs, he heard shouting, the sound of furniture being overturned. And then, Subject 1 secure. I repeat, we have Delilah Vandermeer in custody. But something felt wrong. Jake's cop instincts, honed by 12 years on patrol, were screaming at him. The downstairs office thermal imaging had shown someone in there. Where were they? Lisa, Jake said urgently. The office. Someone was in the office. They moved quickly down a hallway, following the sounds of agents clearing rooms. The office door was open, light spilling out. Inside, they found a workspace that made the underground laboratory look primitive. Multiple computer screens, genetic sequencing equipment, filing cabinets, and on one wall, a massive display showing what appeared to be genealogical charts for hundreds of dogs. But the room was empty. Check for hidden exits, Lisa commanded. But Jake was already moving toward the desk. Something had caught his eye, a small blinking light on one of the monitors. A deletion program, currently running, wiping files in real time. They're destroying evidence. Jake shouted. Someone was just here. An agent rushed to the computer, trying to stop the deletion, but it was too late. Files were disappearing by the thousands. Years of research and client records vanishing into digital oblivion. Then Jake heard a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. Running water. A toilet flushing. Bathroom. Jake yelled. Someone's in the bathroom. The attached bathroom door was closed. 2 agents approached, weapons drawn. Federal agents. Come out with your hands visible. No response. One agent tried the handle. Locked. They looked at each other. And then the larger agent kicked the door open. Splinters flying. The bathroom was empty. But the window was wide open, desert air pouring in. Jake rushed to it and looked out, seeing a figure in the distance, running across the desert terrain toward a cluster of rocks about 200 yards away. Runner heading east. Jake reported. Female, approximately 5'5", dark clothing. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the comm. I've got visual. Subject is moving toward what looks like... Wait, there's a vehicle. There's a goddamn vehicle hidden in those rocks. Jake watched in frustration as the figure reached a camouflaged 4x4 truck. Whoever it was had planned this, an escape vehicle positioned beyond the perimeter. Hidden from aerial surveillance, probably supplied with cash, fake IDs, and everything needed to disappear. Helicopter in pursuit. The pilot announced. Local units intercepted coordinates, but then something unexpected happened. The figure stopped running. Just stopped, 20 feet from the vehicle, standing perfectly still in the desert dawn. Jake grabbed binoculars from an agent's tactical kit and focused on the person. It was a young man, maybe 30 years old, wearing a laboratory coat over his clothes. He stood with his hands at his sides, staring at the helicopter approaching from the west, at the police vehicles converging from multiple directions, at the absolute impossibility of escape. And then he raised his hands above his head in surrender. Subject 2 surrendering, Rebecca reported. All units, approach with caution. 20 minutes later, the young man sat in handcuffs in the back of a police vehicle. His name was Dr. David Chun, and according to the ID they'd found on him, he was a geneticist who'd been working with the Vandermeers for 18 months. I want a deal, David said immediately, his voice shaking. I want immunity, and I'll tell you everything. Everything. You're in no position to negotiate, Rebecca said coldly. Yes, I am, David insisted. Because I know where the backup facility is. I know where Delilah stored the genetic samples. I know about the client's senators, celebrities, tech billionaires. I can give you all of it. But I want immunity. Rebecca and Lisa exchanged glances. Jake could see them calculating. Was David Chun a valuable asset, or just a desperate criminal trying to save himself? Upstairs, Delilah Vandermeer was being led out in handcuffs, her gray hair disheveled, her face a mask of defiant rage. She was dressed in an expensive silk robe, bare feet shuffling across her own marble floor. When she saw the federal agents photographing her home, cataloging her equipment, dismantling her life's work, something in her expression cracked. You don't understand, she said, her voice hoarse. We were advancing humanity. We were creating perfection. Those animals, they weren't suffering. They were evolving. Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, an agent said, continuing to read her Miranda rights. But Delilah wasn't listening. Her eyes found Jake, standing in the hallway, and recognition flashed across her face. You, she hissed. The cop who found our test subject. Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? We were months away from eliminating hereditary diseases in dogs. Years away from applying the same techniques to human genetics. We could have saved millions of lives. You were torturing animals for profit, Jake said quietly. You were breaking federal laws and selling designer pets to rich people who treated them like accessories. Don't pretend this was about science. Delilah's face contorted with fury. You're just a small-town cop who got lucky. You have no idea. I have every idea, Jake interrupted. I've seen your facility. I've seen the dogs you kept in cages their entire lives. I've seen the tattoos you burned into their skin. I've seen the files showing you sold puppies for $500,000 each. This wasn't research. This was a business. And business is now closed. As Delilah was led away to a transport vehicle, still protesting, still insisting she was a misunderstood visionary, Jake felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Both Vandermeers were now in custody. The operation was shut down. The evidence was secured, or at least most of it. Rebecca approached Jake as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. "We couldn't have done this without you, Officer Morrison. That puppy you rescued, that was the thread that unraveled everything." Jake nodded, watching as the last of the evidence was loaded into vehicles. "What happens now?" "Now? Now comes the hard part," Rebecca said. "Building the prosecution, tracking down the clients, ensuring these animals get the care they need. The Vandermeers are looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. With David Chun's testimony, maybe more. And the clients? The people who bought these dogs? We're going after all of them," Rebecca promised. "Conspiracy charges, illegal purchase of genetically modified animals, supporting a criminal enterprise. Some of them are very powerful people, which means this is going to get ugly. But we have Emily's testimony and now David's cooperation. We have bank records, communications, everything we need." As they drove away from the ranch, Jake looked back one last time at the luxury home that had hidden such darkness. He thought about Lucky, waiting for him back in California, tail wagging, completely unaware that he'd brought down a criminal empire. Sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it came from the smallest voices. Sometimes it came from a puppy who refused to give up, even when the world was swallowing him whole. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood outside the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, adjusting his dress uniform one final time. The morning sun reflected off the building's glass facade, and media trucks lined the street like a caravan of vultures, all waiting for the verdict that would close one of the most sensational criminal cases in recent California history. Inside the courthouse, a jury was deliberating the fate of Marcus and Delilah Vandermeer. The trial had lasted 8 weeks and had become a media sensation. Every day brought new revelations: celebrity clients who'd purchased genetically modified dogs, tech billionaires who'd paid obscene amounts for perfect pets, even 2 sitting congressmen who'd been implicated in the scandal. The prosecution, armed with Emily Torres's documentation, David Chun's testimony, and the mountains of evidence seized from 3 separate facilities, had built an overwhelming case. Jake had testified on day 12, recounting the rescue of Lucky from the Quicksand, the discovery of the tattoos, his investigation into the Thornton property, and the eventual raid on the underground facility. The defense attorneys had tried to discredit him, suggesting he'd acted recklessly, violated protocols, and contaminated the investigation. But Jake had remained calm, professional, and unshakable. The evidence spoke for itself. "Hey, hero cop!" A familiar voice called out. Jake turned to see Detective Lisa Hartwell approaching, looking sharp in a navy pantsuit. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Jake admitted. "You think they'll convict?" Lisa snorted. "With that evidence? The jury would have to be blind, deaf, and morally bankrupt to let them walk. We've got them on everything: animal cruelty, genetic modification without permits, tax evasion, conspiracy, fraud. The Vandermeers are going away for a long time." Behind them, a silver sedan pulled up to the courthouse steps. Emily Torres emerged, looking dramatically different from the terrified young woman who'd walked into the police station 6 months ago. Her hair was styled, her clothing professional, and most importantly, her eyes held confidence instead of fear. She'd spent months in witness protection, but she'd also spent that time preparing for her new life. Accepted into a veterinary graduate program at Cornell University with a full scholarship, funded by an animal welfare organization, impressed by her courage. "Emily!" Jake called out, waving her over. She smiled, a genuine warm smile, and jogged up the steps. "I can't believe it's almost over," she said. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for the Vandermeers to escape again somehow." "Not this time," Lisa assured her. "They're finished." And you're the main reason why. You should be proud. Emily's eyes glistened with tears. I just wish I'd come forward sooner. Maybe those dogs wouldn't have suffered as long. You came forward when you were ready, Jake interrupted gently. You risked everything to do the right thing. That takes real courage. A courthouse clerk appeared at the main entrance. The jury is back. They've reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Jake, Lisa, and Emily found seats in the gallery behind the prosecution team. Special Agent Rebecca Torres sat at the prosecutor's table, looking calm and confident. Across the aisle, Marcus and Delilah Vandermeer sat in orange prison jumpsuits, their expensive lawyers flanking them like bodyguards. Marcus looked older, his face gaunt from months in detention. But Delilah looked defiant, her chin raised, her eyes burning with undiminished conviction that she'd been right all along. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Patricia Kowalski presiding. Judge Kowalski entered, the same judge who'd signed Jake's original search warrant. She surveyed the courtroom with stern eyes that had seen every kind of criminal excuse and manipulation imaginable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand you've reached a verdict? The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a schoolteacher's bearing. We have your honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit animal cruelty, how do you find? Guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jake felt Emily grab his hand, squeezing tight. On the charge of illegal genetic modification of animals? Guilty. On the charge of operating an unlicensed research facility? Guilty. The guilty verdicts continued, charge after charge, count after count. Tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering. 37 separate charges in total. 37 guilty verdicts. Marcus Vandermeer's head dropped into his hands. Delilah remained motionless, staring straight ahead, refusing to show any emotion, even as her entire world crumbled around her. The defendants will return for sentencing in 30 days, Judge Kowalski announced. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the media descended like locusts. Jake and Lisa pushed through the crowd, shielding Emily from the cameras, and shouted questions. They made it to Lisa's car and drove away, leaving the circus behind. 30 days until sentencing, Emily said from the back seat. How long do you think they'll get? Federal sentencing guidelines suggest 15 to 20 years minimum, Lisa said. With all the charges, potentially much more. The Vandermeers will probably die in prison. Jake stared out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, but also a kind of melancholy. He'd seen too many crimes in his career, too much unnecessary suffering. This case was a victory, but it didn't erase the years those animals had spent in cages, didn't undo the genetic manipulation they'd endured. Where to? Lisa asked. Jake smiled. I need to pick up Lucky. He's got a vet appointment this afternoon. An hour later, Jake pulled up to Riverside Animal Hospital. Dr. Sarah Chun was waiting outside with Lucky, now a healthy, energetic 6-month-old golden retriever whose coat shimmered like spun gold in the afternoon sun. When Lucky saw Jake, his entire body wiggled with excitement, his tail wagging so hard it seemed like it might fly off. There's my boy, Jake said, kneeling down as Lucky launched himself into his arms, licking his face with unbridled joy. Sarah laughed. He's been watching the door all day. I swear he knows when you're coming. How's he doing? Any health issues from the genetic modifications? Sarah's expression grew serious. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been consulting with geneticists and veterinary specialists across the country about Lucky and the other dogs from the Vandermeer facilities. The genetic modifications are ... complicated. Some of the changes appear to be benign or even Beneficial enhanced immune systems, reduced genetic predispositions to certain diseases. But we're in uncharted territory. We don't know if there will be long-term effects. Jake's heart clenched. Is he going to be okay? I think so, Sarah said carefully. Lucky is healthy, happy, and showing no signs of problems. But we'll need to monitor him closely throughout his life. He's going to need regular checkups, genetic screening, and careful observation. He's essentially a pioneer. We're learning from him and the other modified dogs what the long-term consequences of this kind of genetic engineering might be. Jake looked down at Lucky, who gazed back at him with absolute trust and love. Whatever he needs, he'll get it. He saved himself, Emily, those other dogs, and brought down a criminal empire. He's earned the best life I can give him. 3 weeks later, Jake attended Emily Torres's going-away party. She was heading to Cornell in a few days to start her graduate program. The party was held at Dr. Chun's animal hospital, and it seemed like half the county has shown up: police officers, federal agents, animal welfare workers, and even some of the families who'd adopted dogs from the Vandermeer facilities. Emily stood on a makeshift stage, really just a wooden platform, and addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear. 6 months ago, I was complicit in something terrible. I convinced myself that I was just doing my job, that I wasn't responsible for the decisions being made above me. But conscience doesn't work that way. We're all responsible for our choices, and I made the wrong choice for too long. The room was silent, everyone hanging on her words. But I also learned that it's never too late to do the right thing. That one person, one act of courage, even a small one, can change everything. I let one puppy escape, hoping someone would find him and ask questions. And that tiny act of rebellion brought down an empire and saved dozens of lives. She looked directly at Jake. Officer Morrison, you could have just handed Lucky to animal control and moved on with your patrol. But you didn't. You investigated. You cared. You risked your career to pursue justice. You're the real hero of this story. Jake shook his head, but Emily continued. And Lucky, sweet, brave Lucky, he refused to give up even when the earth was swallowing him. He fought for every breath. And that fighting spirit inspired all of us to keep fighting too. The crowd applauded. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Later that evening, after the party had ended and the guests had departed, Jake sat in his backyard with Lucky curled up beside him. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the desert sky. Lucky's head rested on Jake's lap, the dog's breathing slow and peaceful. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Lisa, sentencing tomorrow. You coming? Jake typed back, wouldn't miss it. The next day, Marcus and Delilah Vandermeer each received 18 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Kowalski had been harsh in her remarks, condemning their arrogance, cruelty, and complete disregard for the sanctity of life. 23 of their wealthy clients were also charged, their cases still pending. The Vandermeers' assets, totaling over $40 million, were seized and distributed to animal welfare organizations and genetic research ethics programs. Jake attended the sentencing with Lucky by his side. The courthouse had made a special exception, allowing the dog who'd started it all to be present. As the Vandermeers were led away in handcuffs, Delilah's eyes found Lucky one last time. She stared at the golden retriever who destroyed everything she'd built, and for just a moment, Jake thought he saw something in her expression. Not remorse, exactly, but perhaps recognition. Recognition that she'd been defeated by the smallest, most vulnerable creature in her entire operation. That evening, Jake took Lucky for a walk along the same back roads where they'd first met. When they reached mile marker 7 on Thornton Road, Jake stopped. The area looked different. Now the Thornton property had been seized by the county and was scheduled to be demolished. The underground facility had been filled with concrete, erasing the nightmare that had existed beneath the surface. "This is where it all started, buddy," Jake said, scratching Lucky behind his ears. "Right here. You were sinking into that quicksand, fighting for your life, and you changed everything." Lucky wagged his tail, completely unconcerned with philosophy or history. He was focused on the present moment, the cool evening air, the interesting smells, and the human he loved standing beside him. Jake smiled. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not every story needed to be about grand gestures or dramatic heroics. Sometimes the most important thing was simply refusing to give up, even when the world seemed determined to swallow you whole. Sometimes survival itself was the greatest victory. "Come on, Lucky," Jake said, starting back toward his patrol car. "Let's go home." As they drove away from Thornton Road for the last time, the sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and orange. In the rearview mirror, Jake could see Lucky in the back seat, his nose pressed against the window, tail wagging, completely and perfectly happy. A tiny puppy had nearly died in quicksand, but he'd survived. He'd fought. And in fighting, he'd saved not just himself, but dozens of other innocent creatures. Jake had learned a lot in his 12 years as a police officer. But Lucky had taught him the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the smallest lives create the biggest miracles, and that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, even in a patch of quicksand on a forgotten road in the middle of nowhere. Justice had been served. The criminals were behind bars. The animals were safe. And lucky, brave, beautiful, miraculous Lucky was finally truly home.